You're listening to the Augmented Experience podcast. I'm your host, as usual, Joshua Vellis. I'm a student, musician, and a gamer at heart. Join me as I sit down every week to talk about all the latest news in the technology, business, and video game world. I hope you guys enjoy. All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. My name is Joshua Vellis. I am your host, as usual. And obviously, today is a episode 50th special, like you guys voted on. And obviously, this is the big interview episode, so I hope you guys are going to enjoy this one. So obviously, we're going to do a little bit different around here for this episode, especially because normally you guys know how the interviews usually go. I tend to, unironically, end up taking most of the spotlight for some reason. But I think this one's going to be a little bit more of letting the reins loose because I actually have two people that are more knowledgeable on a topic that I actually don't even know. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and we can pretty much go from there, guys.
Hello, I'm Dr. Donna Hamilton, and I am a biology professor at the University of North Texas, Dallas.
My name is Richard Burgess. Hello, everyone. I'm an instructor at in the College of Engineering at Texas Tech University, and also a Ph.D. student in Systems and Engineering Management.
All right, so thank you for Mr. Burgess and Dr. Hamilton for coming on. Obviously, I think you guys have heard me mention Mr. Burgess before a little bit when we mentioned a little bit of ethics when I think it was during the mainstream gaming with Garrett. Obviously, Mr. Burgess was one of my professors at Texas Tech during my time. Well, still there. So he was my engineering ethics professor. So I wanted to have them on to talk about a topic that I asked them to come on originally to just come on and talk anything regarding ethics and something related to the field of engineering. But obviously, we ended up turning this thing into a little bit more of basically a multi-conversation over something far different. And I'm going to let them talk about a little bit of what they do and, let them decide how they want to go into explaining the topic. So.
All right, thanks. So the topic that we're going to talk to you about is one area that the two of us collaborate on, and this is the area of biomimicry. And so I think we need to define that term because one thing that we found out very quickly is that not everybody agrees what that word actually means. It's one of those words where everybody says, yeah, I know what that means, but in fact, we're talking about different things. So for our purposes, what we're talking about with biomimicry is human-built systems or structures that are mimicking something that we have observed to work in nature. And so that's kind of the broad strokes of what it means.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that characterization, and I think the appeal is, and we can delve into this further, but I think the appeal, especially in the domain of, say, engineering, is we have a lot of time-tested strategies and materials that engineers are interested in imitating for successful deployment in a variety of applications.
Yeah, so that pretty much covers the idea of what biomimicry is. Obviously, guys, based on who I am, I have no idea what that is. But obviously, I talked to Mr. Burgess and Dr. Franklin a little bit about it, and they've even sent me an article regarding it. And so I think it's pretty much, asking the question is why did you guys actually choose to study biomimicry? What made it stick out, out of all the, many topics that people always consider, big engineering questions, why is this something you guys decided to research out of all the other topics?
Well, it came out of actually a conversation that the two of us had. So we were talking about, what were we talking about? We were talking about
autonomous vehicles.
That's
right?
what it was.
Yeah.
Autonomous vehicles, and he mentioned that some of the programming systems that they use in autonomous vehicles are modeled on animal systems. And so some of them are modeled on ant colony systems of travel. Some of them are modeled on the birds, right? The bird migration, the V's of the geese. And my question was, so you're modeling these systems, but in the animal systems, the individual doesn't matter, right? So the individual goose or the individual ant doesn't matter. It's not important. Individual survival doesn't matter. And I kind of was worried. Are we really basing these systems of autonomous vehicles on, a system where the individual doesn't matter? Because I assume that in a autonomous vehicle system, you would want the individual to matter.
Yeah, I think that pretty much makes sense. So, yeah, I kind of see what you're going with that. So, I think there's also another thing that it's kind of interesting though that I think a lot of people tend to forget, especially when we're going into topics like, especially like creating, like mimicking nature in some designs. Obviously, I think that there's some areas that it would make sense to do that, but obviously, you know, a lot of people are like, okay, there's still some gray areas or areas that we've tried this and it hasn't worked before. Like, and I think this is a great segue of really going into it, like examples of biomimicry in our society. And I think obviously, if we want to start with the negatives first,
Sure.
I think starting with negatives first, at least, because I think it's being honest with some people that, you know, Apple has done the same thing with the whole keyboard thing with the butterfly keyboard,
Right.
which is they decided to take the ideas of designing a keyboard and replace the traditional X pattern that's normally on keyboard switches and switch them for butterflies. They call it the butterfly keyboard for a reason. The only problem is that while it does act in the same way as a butterfly when it's flapping its wings, it's also as fragile as a butterfly wings. And obviously that plays some negative effects because it leads to unreliable keyboards essentially for computers. And obviously I get what Apple's going for with their whole design language, that they want small, thin, like minimal, and they considered future, like making it look like the future, but obviously at the cost of practicality. And it led to a lot of other issues, like obviously using a smaller keyboard and everything with the butterfly because it's so thin, you know, heating for the CPUs, and obviously it hasn't worked out so well. It's led to thermal throttling and a lot of big issues, and it's led people to leaving Apple for other products. And even though people that don't like using Windows, they just leave using MacBooks because they're like, well, we can't work with this. Like, we can't do our daily routines
Right.
with these products. And like, obviously it leads in a whole other discussion of like high school students having MacBooks for notes, but I'm like, okay, that's stupid. Let's be honest here. That's a little bit overkill. You guys are not doing anything to use that. But what is another example you guys like presented? Because I remember you mentioned something about like AI and going over like AV and things like that.
Sure, but I think one really great one. Do you want to talk about Lotus Leaves?
Well, yeah, and one of the first things, I guess, one of the early things I want to do is one of the things we like to do is make a distinction between materials biomimicry and process biomimicry. And so we have a pretty rich tradition of materials biomimicry. And so this is where we're, just as it sounds, we're imitating at a material at a kind of structural level. So a good example is Velcro. It's a fairly ubiquitous piece of technology that was definitely directly inspired by the way plant burrs behave, or looking at the way certain wind turbine blades are being designed to imitate the shape of a whale fin in terms of moving through a fluid, right, more dynamically, more efficiently. So there's plenty of examples and successes in the materials domain. Where we kind of have focused to a certain extent more recently is in the process domain. This is where things like the aforementioned optimization strategies with ant colony movement or swarm movement with birds, that's where we're starting to see some process level kind of imitation. The lotus leaf is a great example that kind of, I guess, stands between these two domains. So engineers were interested in developing a paint that was basically self-cleaning. And so to this end, they looked to the lotus leaf because lotus leaves are really good for letting water just kind of roll over them. They're hydrophobic. And so water just kind of runs off, and it tends to run and wash some of the grit off of the leaf at the same time. So this was a pretty desirable strategy. And so some engineers and other folks got together and imitated this in a paint, so they could apply an exterior paint that, when it dried, imitated some of the microstructural properties of the lotus leaf. And sure enough, you got something that would kind of slough off dirt and things like that. What they didn't take into account is something I think Dr. Hamilton can speak to if you'd like to. Yeah.
Right. So it was really successful as far as shedding water quickly and what it was designed for. The engineers didn't fail. They succeeded. It did what it was designed to do. Unfortunately, what happened was that they failed to take into context, and context is a really important concept in some of the work we do, the context of the lotus leaf. And so if you look at any plant, especially a deciduous plant, right, one that sheds its leaves, that's the point. They shed their leaves. So the structure itself, that lotus leaf, is not a permanent structure. It's not a very long-lived structure. And so what happened was, while the lotus can stay healthy, shedding these leaves and preventing any big, sort of buildup of fungus or bacteria, the structures that were painted with the paint couldn't. And so they started to see huge buildups of bacteria, huge buildups of fungus in this paint. And so while they succeeded, they had this problem that really should have been foreseen if they had considered the context. But it was, and they fixed it now, and it was cost a lot of time and money to fix. But that's
clearly
a pretty simple, I guess,
Yeah.
example. And there have been examples too of where the biomimicry, the structure or the system being mimicked, is misunderstood. So Eastgate is a really attractive building. Wasn't it like the winner of a design competition
I think
like 10 years ago?
Yeah,
So it's a building in Zimbabwe that was based on the structure of a termite mound. And so the part of the challenge was you're in a country with very little access to electricity, and so how do you maintain a workable temperature in an office building? And they designed the structure based on what they perceived to be how a termite's nest. And so these are these giant termite mounds that you see. African termites are their own sort of group. And they based the building structure on that. And it was super successful. They basically built this building to be kind of an induction system where they had the hot air going out the top of the building and cooler air sweeping in through the side of it, so that they had constant airflow. Well, so it was successful, but that's not how termite mounds work.
Yeah.
And so it was based on a faulty understanding of the termite, but they got lucky because it totally did what they needed it to do. But so sometimes they get lucky and sometimes they don't. It's really important to understand the context and the biological basis of what you're trying to mimic.
Yeah, and I think even recognizing the current state of your own knowledge or understanding of the system, right? So kind of know what you know, and conversely know what you don't know. So the Eastgate Center is exactly, it stands out as a really pretty profound success. I mean, the challenge was to build this office building in Zimbabwe without air conditioning. In a part of the world where temperatures vary pretty dramatically to 100 plus degrees down into, very cool temperatures, even I think just above freezing, if I remember correctly. So a really wide range. And it was, they were able to build this and keep the building comfortable even without the air conditioning and do it for a fraction of the energy costs. So it sort of stand it as this success, but as Dr. Hamilton mentioned it, to a certain extent, they got kind of lucky based on the process they thought they were imitating.
I think it's also kind of a dangerous thing too, is that I don't think I think we even talked about this in class one time, especially because your expertise is more in ethics and like ethical principles. And I think that kind of plays a good question. It's like, are we really going to play like a game of chance with people's lives in that aspect? Because, there's some aspects where, it makes sense. Like, if we're not really using people as I'd say basically toys in this scenario.
Yeah.
But I think, doesn't that present like an ethical question? Like, hey, are we doing the right thing here? Like, we're also playing with people's lives. Because like I said, this building was based on a misunderstanding of how an anthill works. So it's like, and they got lucky. Like, if anything went wrong, things could have went wrong really easily.
Well, and I think that actually circles back around to the AV systems that are based on these social insect systems. And do you want to talk about that, like some of the decision making for those AV systems that don't match the animal model?
Yeah, so I think so. There's a couple things to keep in mind. I mean, what I think makes this such an interesting topic from an ethics perspective is there are kind of overt threats to human health, welfare, and safety, right? So those are definitely things to pay attention to. If you're looking at something like the Eastgate Center, part of what you're looking at is whether or not people are being kept in a comfortable temperature environment. And so someone might sort of be initially cavalier or dismissive because, well, there's no safety issue here, but when you're talking about millions and millions of dollars and people's comfort and productivity, there's substantial outcomes as far as the welfare of people are concerned, and I think it's easy to kind of glaze over that. To Dr. Hamilton's earlier point, the issue with doing these kinds of crossovers, and I think it's especially true in process biomimicry, is there's all kinds of values or at least purposes that are implicit in the natural system that people may not be aware of. And so when they're doing this kind of copy and paste approach to biomimicry, they're importing purposes that might be at odds with our purposes or our sort of desideratas. So the optimization is a pretty good example of this. So the idea with optimization strategies is to coordinate the movement of multiple, in this case, vehicles, right? So if we have autonomous vehicles and we have a mass amount of autonomous vehicles, and we want to, say, move them between point A and B as efficiently as possible, we might look at how other critters around us manage to do that. And so ants, for example, are very good at identifying the most efficient path between A and B. And so there's a whole kind of approach called ant colony optimization that looks to coordinate the movement of autonomous vehicles in a very similar way. Well, we really need to dig into the mechanism of that as well as the assumptions. So the mechanism, when ants, for example, navigate between 2 points, you have some initial ants that go out and they're not going to find the most efficient path right away. But what happens is they drop these little sort of pheromone packets periodically. And as more and more ants stumble on the correct path, there's a greater density of pheromone packets. And so the ants learn to follow the one with the greatest density because that ends up being the most efficient path.
Yeah, it's an easy way to identify, hey, like, basically you're choosing, it's like, okay, so this one doesn't clearly have as much in comparison, like, there's not enough here, but this one's, like, piping hot. Like,
right, exactly. Yeah, think about it like the nature's version of Waze, right?
Yeah,
I mean, right, so you're getting this kind of feedback, but let's think about what that requires. That means individual vehicles have to be sort of subsumed to the collective good. In other words, my vehicle might be the one that has to figure out what the least efficient path is. And then there's also, what information am I leaving behind? What's the equivalent of a pheromone packet when you're in an autonomous vehicle? And how much information about me in particular, or at a minimum my vehicle and where I'm at any given point in time, is now out there for some level of public consumption. So there's, for example, privacy issues. Again, all of this in the context of nature is less problematic if you're looking at a collectivist system, right? It's not the welfare of the individual ant or the welfare of the individual bird that's important, it's the collective good. But if you think about a society like the U.S., which is very individualistic, let's say, if we paint with a very broad brush, people may not be so sanguine about, them being subsumed to the greater good. They're like, I don't want to be subsumed to the greater good. I want to get to my office as quickly as possible. So I don't necessarily want to be sacrificed for the greater good. And if we don't bring those assumptions and those purposes, if we don't put them explicitly on the table, then we're going to get a whole lot of things with our copy and paste procedure that we might not have intended. So that's kind of a rough...
Right, and just to expand a little bit on that, so it goes, the concerns are really kind of broad, because it goes from not being perhaps willing to submit to the greater good in terms of time. So maybe I'm going to be 15 minutes late instead of 15 minutes early because that's for the greater good. So that's one end of the spectrum. But the other end of the spectrum is in a crash scenario or where there is absolutely going to be a death, the decisions that are made by these autonomous vehicles as to who dies, how many die, like it goes the whole spectrum. And I think for some Americans, it's actually the same weight, right? Because if I'm in my car, I own my car, I want to be on time. Like, I do not want to be 15 minutes late. Like, that's my car. That's why I have a car. That's why I don't take the train every day, is because it's on me. And so that's almost, maybe it's hyperbole, but I think Americans in particular are going to feel very strongly about increasing the commute for the greater good. But of course, then when you really do get up to the higher stakes of if there's some wreck scenario, I want to survive. I want to be the choice. And so if everybody wants to be the choice, then how does that work? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think that even leads into like personal thing that I've even talked to people about, like the whole idea of like, I know it's kind of off topic, but it kind of relates to the whole idea is like, being the, like, you want to be the one that, like, I don't want to be like, hey, I'm fine with laying down my life for the greater good. Like, most people in the U.S., based on examples I've seen, they're like, yeah, about that.
Right.
Like, I'm trying to go to work. I'm not trying to die today.
Exactly.
But it's kind of like the whole thing I tell people, like, when they say like bad advice, when they say like don't follow your passions and things like that, because I found that it's interesting that somebody considered that bad advice, because I'm like, well, it kind of sounds fair, like follow your passions. That's just like, if you're passionate about doing this, you should follow it. But then somebody brought up a point. Well, think about it like this: if everybody would follow their passion, then who would be the ones that would be doing the maintenance work or civil work? And I'm like, I think it's true.
I mean, I would argue, I teach a lot of returning students, and so I could argue that some of those maintenance workers and custodians, for example, they're in school, they are following their passion, or they're artists, or they're writers, and they're paying the bills somehow. But I do agree with your point that our society, and this is really, really true in American society, values the individual, values the individual path. You should follow the path that is going to lead you to the most fulfillment. And we aren't raised with this idea that the path that's going to give you the most fulfillment is the path that contributes to society as a whole the most. Not that your work doesn't, but I mean, in terms of that whole utilitarian Spock approach, right?
Yeah,
like the most good for the most people, right? What is it? The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, right? So that isn't how our society is structured. And so I think you're absolutely right that it ties into that.
As I said, it's interesting because, especially when we go into the whole debate, like especially with AI, because I know AI is obviously a big topic nowadays, especially even privacy as well. Like Mr. Burgess, I'm interested he brought that up too, because it's like, that's kind of like, I think that's easy. Like that's even how people in the smartphone industry, that's how they're going to be able to get people to buy phones, is because of privacy. Like every time I see a Google conference, they're always like, emphasizing on privacy. Apple's recent conference, WWDC, we focus on privacy. We're doing more privacy features, and so it's like, it's kind of a good back and forth. But it's also interesting because everybody nowadays, especially, is they just want to focus on their privacy. Like they don't want their information getting out. Like they want to hold their cards close to their chest. But obviously, especially when we're trying to be in a society where we want to help the greater good, but also, there's always a sacrifice. There's always something you have to give up. Like there is not always a utopia where like, oh yeah, we can have this and this at the same time. It's like there's has to be something that gives. It's compromise. And it's even what I tell people with the whole smartphone market. Like it's collapsed at this point. We've already peaked in sales and everything, and it's not going up anytime soon because the prices keep going up with phones, and they keep cramming in all these features that most people aren't going to use.
Right.
So that somebody brought up a point. They're like, instead of innovating, we need to compromise. Like phone manufacturers need to learn how to compromise, because it's like, you can't expect people to keep paying these huge prices and wanting to upgrade phones every year, because it doesn't work. And this kind of goes in the whole thing. It's like the greatest good for everybody. Like, there's some people that, they'll drop another $2,000 for a phone and they don't care. But there's some people, it's like, I don't have $2,000 to spend like that. Like there's some people that in society, aren't as fortunate as others. So you have to find a way to compromise in the area and meet the customer halfway. And I think it kind of makes a little bit more sense, especially with privacy and everything, because if you're going to spend money on something, you want to make sure that your information is secure with that. Especially we live in a day and age where everybody is doing everything on the internet. Internet at this point is considered a utility. It's basically considered a necessity in society nowadays, because nobody wants to send letters anymore. Nobody wants to use phone call. Well, you still have to call somebody, but I'm assuming emailing them is just quickly, like you can just email them quickly, or if you just want to phone call them on Skype or something like that, you can do that.
Right, and it's actually required for school, right? So like you have to use the internet for a lot of school.
Like you see a lot of schools spending tons of money on IT departments, and you see them all spending all this money on cybersecurity and things like that. So it's like, if we start going in this mindset of like applying some ideas in nature, we also have to keep in mind that, with like you even mentioned too, is like in nature does not care about what we're doing. Like nature operates far differently compared to human society in some aspects. Like they're not dealing with, am I going to have an internet bill? Like they don't need to deal with all this stuff. Like nature is
and also for the most part, natural systems and evolution and natural selection are not, it works at the group level, right? It works at the population level. What's the best for the population? So it's very much not at the individual level. So the population level is always going to be more important in terms of natural selection. And, it's interesting too that, sometimes, so in nature, altruism does evolve, right? So we were talking about the individual versus the population. And so, altruism does evolve, but, it kind of swings back and forth, because altruism helps the group, but it hurts the individual. And so we actually see that swing back and forth in, the same group or the same, genus or family of animals over time to kind of evolve back and forth, because there's always a cost. as you just said. Somebody's going to pay.
And especially when we're playing the game with like autonomous vehicles and, you know, making them in better, obviously you have to collect a ton of data. Like that's why Tesla recently came out, I think it was earlier in the day, they came out with an article regarding that they were going to have AI even more advanced to the point that it parks a car like a human being in your driveway and everything with no issues, and it can drive by itself like a human being on a freeway and all these things, and do multi-state travel by 2024. Obviously, that requires a lot of data. That requires them to have people willing to give up their privacy and information and their driving habits to improve Teslas for everybody. And obviously, like, you know, I tell people like nowadays, obviously by the time that people like in my age, you know, in theory, whatever they decide to do, and if they get a degree and everything, or if that's their boat, and have money to buy a Tesla, it's going to be a lot cheaper by then, because everybody that has a Tesla right now is, I always consider, they're just test subjects. That's all they are right now. Yeah. Like, I think that's the easiest, as messed up as that sounds. They're basically, they're beta testers.
That's right.
Like, as much as people don't want to admit it, you're spending a lot of money on a car that is going to get, I'd say easily it's going to get replaced in the future, and it's going to be a lot cheaper. Like, you're going to have something that's better and cheaper in the future, and you guys just paid the premium for something that was just a beta, essentially.
But that's always true, right? So think about the people who bought the first computers. Like, those Commodore 64s and Tandies were not cheap for their time, but, you know, after a couple decades,
like computers became a lot more affordable.
Everyone can afford,
and then obviously,
like a Chromebook, or most people can. Or
I think a Chromebook's fairly easy to afford. Like, you can pretty much find one on eBay for like $50.
Exactly.
So I think even that, like, that's a fair, at least for anybody. And that's like, I've even mentioned this before, like the whole MacBook Pros for high school students. I'm like, I don't know what's going through parents' minds with these kids having these kind of computers. Like,
well, and Chromebooks too. It's not an advertisement, but they're really sturdy. I know this because I work with some charities that actually request Chromebooks for their students going off to college that they support, but not to get that's a little bit of a rabbit hole to go down. But.
Yeah, that's why I agree with you that, like, we're not trying to sponsor anything here, but except my Patreon page. That's right. Besides that,
no, I think so. I mean, I just want to kind of build on this. I think there is an emerging tension between people wanting to maintain their privacy, but also, as you said earlier, wanting to have the benefits that come along with, say, coordination. So one of the appeals of optimization strategies in autonomous vehicles is that you get sort of the safety features that a lot of proponents of autonomous vehicles are pushing. And then you also get these increases in fuel economy, increases in time efficiency. You see a lower environmental impact vis-a-vis lower emissions. You see basically the functional expansion of infrastructure, because you can move more vehicles through a given space, because you can move them closer together at higher speeds when they're coordinated. So we want all these benefits, and at some point, sort of collectively, or as a group in any event, we have to kind of figure out what's the price that we want to pay for that. And I think it's interesting that we're willing to pay. That's right. And part of where our work comes in is to say, let's be aware of what the price is to begin with, because what's not obvious to us is that people are always aware of that they're sort of saying, hey, this nature does this one aspect really well, and we want to imitate that, but we don't necessarily know the whole package of assumptions and purposes that come along with that. I want to say too, I've been looking at this, and sort of in my domain, in my research, I'm interested in water system resilience, and certainly there are water scholars that talk about wanting to make systems more resilient by imitating nature. And here again, we see this kind of tension between the welfare of the individual versus the welfare of the collective, because that system might be made more resilient by sacrificing an individual. And that makes it sound very intentional, and I'm not necessarily trying to imply some level of intentionality at the natural level, but resilience in this particular example may come at a cost, and that might just be what we decide to pay. The big thing that I'm interested in from an ethics perspective, I think both of us are interested from an ethics perspective, is let's begin by being aware of what the price is, right? Let's be aware of the sort of implicit value assumptions that are being made when we do this crossover. So I think it's going to continue to be an interesting challenge, and one that demonstrates this tension between these different desires. We want to have privacy, but we also want the value of coordination. Well, coordination requires some loss of privacy. So And usually, in my experience in teaching ethics and in talking to people, people tend to avoid the kind of polar extremes, right? So it's not all privacy and it's not all coordination. So then we try to find this sort of meaningful threshold between those, and figuring out where that line is can be complicated.
Yeah, like it's the whole idea of like trying to find a utopia, essentially. Like the idea of like there's always the perfect option, which I think in some aspects, I think, yeah, there's like, I think there is, in some aspects, there may be a right and wrong, but there's also like some big gray areas that we have to know. How do we navigate? How do we be as fair and unbiased in this entire situation, and not let our personal biases get in the way of that?
Right.
And I think that kind of leads into like another question, really, as like I'm trying to think what field specifically would you think of, because you even mentioned like water was one of them. Like, can you really think of like any other ones that would probably be like relevant, and then ethical questions that might pop up in those areas?
So biomimicry?
Yes, with biomimicry and like those areas, like different fields of engineering or...
Yes.
Yeah.
So there has been a lot of work done in sort of medical bioengineering. So scaffolding for growing tissues, drug delivery systems, mimicking cellular systems to do various things. And a lot of those are biomimetic. So that's a whole big field right now in terms of nanotechnology in the medical field. And, you know, sort of the whole idea of mimicking how we do it, how mammal cells, for example, do it, has been helping. There's also a whole field of investigation into biomimicry of photosynthetic systems. So using sunlight to create chemical and then electrical energy. So actually photosynthesis is another relatively new biomimetic field in terms of what I know. Do you want to talk about some of the other?
Honestly, I have to plug at least a couple examples just because I love them and for no other reason. So mole rats, they've been looking at mole rats who also live in Africa, if I remember correctly. Dr. Hamilton's the biologist. Naked mole rats are these rats that live in very low oxygen environments and yet don't come out with any kind of serious damage for it. And so actually some medical folks have been looking at this to see how we might treat someone that has some sort of a stroke or low oxygen event, how we can preserve brain function during that, right? And so the mole rats are sort of serving as an example. And this one I'm bringing up, it's more of a materials example than a process example, but my absolute favorite is looking at woodpeckers. And they're looking at the structure of woodpecker skulls, because when you think about what a woodpecker does, I think a natural question to ask is, why are they not flying around concussed all the time? Because they're just slamming their head against a solid object repeatedly. And so some scientists and engineers have been looking at how we might imitate woodpecker sort of skull structure for, say, helmets. So that has actually very, very positive implications.
Very positive.
The other area that I happened to learn about recently, and I don't know very much about it, is actually some economists. So this gets back to the systems level and where I'm a little, where I have some interest and familiarity, but some economists are looking at how an ecosystem is structured and trying to say, our economic system that emphasizes apex style predators who don't cooperate is not a sustainable system. And so there's a sort of emerging wave of economists and other thinkers who are saying, look, our economic systems need to place a heavier emphasis on diversity amongst companies as well as cooperation, because that's what leads to a more sustainable economy that is, among other things, perhaps more fair or more even in its distribution of goods.
Yeah, and I think that's even... I remember that just brought up something in my head. Like, that's kind of how people usually refer to as, like, especially in different fields, like the things I talk about, like either business, technology, or video games, that obviously cooperation is a big one that people are like, okay, we want crossplay. Like, we want people playing with, obviously, we want people playing on all their platforms together, and every game they play, they can just play wherever they want. But obviously, there's some downsides to it. Like, obviously, the main concern that people have is like Sony working with Microsoft and things like that. Like, there's always those two obviously are back and forth, and then the whole with console and PC, like the whole unbalancing and everything that comes with it. Like, obviously, yes, like as somebody that just recently built a PC, I can definitely tell like there's huge differences between how a PC is going to interact with some games and how a console. Obviously,
Yeah.
there are areas where a console is going to be better. Clearly, like racing games, obviously because the keyboard and mouse aren't so good for that. But anything involving like fast movements or reaction time, you know, it's also limited to who you are as a person, and I'd say probably your equipment to a degree. But it also depends on just the fluidity of a mouse compared to a thumbstick, and the whole idea of like not having big apex people or predators, let's call them that, in the market, and having more diversity overall is just better for the consumer, because more options and more competition equals better products for everybody.
Right.
And obviously, like when you look at the smartphone market or even just things like that, like companies like Silicon Valley is obviously the main point that everybody's going to go to, because they're like, well, basically most of the power in terms of technology is in Silicon Valley, because that's where Facebook, Google, Amazon, all three of those play. Probably Facebook not as much anymore, but Google and Amazon clearly play a huge role. Like that's why people kind of say, like, you know, how much sway do they have in the political side as well? Like how much power do they really have? Because obviously Amazon right now is one of the biggest companies in the world. Jeff Bezos is the richest man on the planet at this point, or I think in the U.S. Is it just the U.S. or is it a planet at this point?
I don't know, actually. I would say easily the U.S., but I'm not positive.
I think the U.S. for sure,
Yeah.
but let's stick with the U.S. because I think if we go to the planet, somebody's going to come at me with something.
Pop up.
That's right. That's
Someone's
right.
going to do that.
Yeah.
But obviously, and then Google, obviously being a company that's well known, it's almost in everyone's house. Everybody likes using Chrome. Sorry, Microsoft Edge. It's just a joke. Everybody uses Edge just to install Chrome at this point. Like, I do that. Like, I think it's just better. But overall, like, it kind of leads to, like, you have all these big corporations, like, specifically, like, 3 or 4 that pretty much can swing as much power as they want because they pretty much run the market. And I think that kind of makes sense why economists would want to, you know, be mindful that, like, hey, we should probably consider changing how we structure things, because we're noticing that in these fields there are big apex predators that are swinging way too much power around.
Yep.
And obviously, especially with Amazon, just keep getting bigger and bigger, like, and to the point that retail stores, like, are very terrified. Like, Walmart's already finding ways to do switching to online and bettering that, because in terms of stores, obviously Walmart has Amazon beat, because Amazon still hasn't really effectively found a way to solidify local shopping, because as much as people like Amazon buying things online and being convenient, most people don't really trust groceries. Like, you can acquire Whole Foods, but not that many people are really going to care because they rather go get it. So that's why people make the whole argument of, like, Amazon needs to learn how to become Walmart before Walmart learns how to become Amazon.
That's a good point.
It is a good point, because it's like, if Walmart figures out how to do that, then, like, as much as Amazon, you know, spent all this time building their infrastructure and everything and their customer base, you know, it can still go downhill for them. They can't be complacent. And I think that's why competition in the market breeds essentially a better system for everybody.
Oh, no, I think it's absolutely true. And I think that in this case, the biomimetic idea is solid, right? You are mimicking a system that is in balance. The issue then, once you start thinking about these things, like, we don't want these, you know, too many of these top hungry, top powerful apex predators. But within an economy, within a marketplace, how do you regulate it? You know, we have antitrust laws. We have, you know, things in place that are meant to do that, but there's a lot of pushback against that shouldn't be necessary, that companies succeed by being the most successful, right? And it sounds a little, you know, like a loop, but you see what I said? They outcompete their competitors, and they're on top for a reason. And for somebody to come in and strong arm that to force diversity, I mean, you know, there's always, well, not always, but I think that there is a huge pushback against that idea, even with the antitrust laws that we have in place.
Yeah, and paradigmatically, I think you would be looking at a sea change, because especially with publicly traded companies, there's a lot of emphasis on maximizing shareholder value, especially shareholder value insofar as it's measured at, say, a quarterly level. Yeah, exactly. So if you're moving to try to imitate a natural system where you start playing the long game, you really have to look at how the incentive structure is set up, what people are going to want. And so that's more than just companies saying, well, we're going to be more cooperative. I mean, the shareholders, right, also have to sort of be on board with playing the long game. And as a species, and this isn't just a society thing, this is at a species level, we are pretty well predisposed to short-term gratification. And
that is true.
So So I think here again, I laud the idea that's being embraced by some of these natural capitalists.
But the context is a little bit different, right? So
Yeah,
the
know your
context,
audience, right?
the temporal
Yeah,
frames are
Right.
different. When you're talking about a balanced ecosystem and the resilience of an ecosystem, you're talking decades or centuries. You're not talking, 3
Yeah.
months of profits.
Especially when you're talking about like messing with the stock market, because everybody gets freaked out the second you start touching that. Because
Exactly.
Sure.
like if anything, like especially I think people even remember 2008 when that hit. Like everybody was like, it
that's
freaked everybody
exactly right.
out. It freaked.
Right,
That's what
right.
I'm saying is like the second you touch anything with the market, I think that's what everybody starts getting crazy because like, hey, like there's a lot of people that are probably swinging around like I don't know how many thousands of dollars in that market. So for somebody that probably just started and put $10, they don't care. Like it's just $10. But anybody that's been playing like I'd say a long-term game
Well, they're
has been
64 and a half years old, right?
Yeah,
so
pretty much.
they're 6 months away from
Right,
retirement.
right,
and
right.
So
they've
it's
been
like-
paying
They're like,
in
oh,
for
bonds are looking pretty good.
decades.
Yeah, that's right.
like
That's when you start
it gets
watching
crazy
it.
because then that's when
Yeah.
I feel like that's when people I think they start paying attention more. Is like as much as people say old people are kind of slow in some aspects. I'd argue there's some areas where they catch us off guard where like especially I think even with my father like there's some areas where my father always teaches me something new, and my dad's already close to I think by the time this comes out dad's will already turn 81 so
Awesome.
so that's what I'm
Yeah.
saying is
Yeah, and you adopt different strategies at different stages of your life, depending on how far you are from your goals and like retirement and whatnot. Yeah, so I think that's sort of something to keep in mind. And one thing that I want to make sure isn't obscured in all of this, we're not anti-biomimicry. In fact, we're pro-biomimicry.
Yeah.
yeah
Our sort of central contention heretofore is that biomimicry is a great idea, but we really need to pay attention to contextual cues like what was the original purpose, over what time frame, who's your audience, and you really have to think about those carefully before engaging in biomimicry. So in other words, just because it's coming from nature doesn't make it categorically superior to the human system.
No, that's exactly what I was going to jump in on. I would agree. We're very, very pro biomimicry. I love the crossover of biology and engineering, biology and technology. I think it's fantastic. But another thing that I really push back against, and that we've talked about a lot, is this romantic notion of, well, if it's natural, it's better. That doesn't work for food, and it doesn't work for engineered systems that are biomimetic. Nature comes across these solutions by iterative mechanisms. So you have decades and centuries and generations to land upon the best solution. But it's very much like the ant system that Rich was talking about earlier, in that it's not directed.
yeah
It's just a random sort of sequence of events in response to the environment. So nature can end up with a very effective solution. And we see this actually, that the same solution is hit upon like in North American deserts as, animals in the Saharan desert. They have the same shape ears and those kind of structures. But it's not always the best because it comes from nature. Nature, evolution and natural selection only work with what they have. So it's as if you had this building and you tell engineers, hey, we want you to improve it, but you have to keep all the structures that are there. And you have to move forward with what's already there.
Yeah.
And so we have some very inefficient structures that have evolved because of the path that evolved them, that they evolved along. So it's really important not to romanticize it. Just because it's biomimetic, that's fantastic. It's a wealth of inspiration for all kinds of engineers and scientists, but it's not, innately better than something that is from the mind of a human engineer. Like there's no qualification there, and that's a very frustrating trope. I think that and stereotype that we run into in a lot of the work that's out there is, well, it's from nature, so it's the best, and that's not how it works.
Yeah, like I think that's how some people tend to do, and based on what I've seen is that some people don't tend to like it when you tell them, hey, it's just it happens random. Like I remember it happened recently with my nephew that his appendix ripped, and we're like, okay, how does that happen? And people are like, it's random. Like you can't really force it to rip. Like if it's like a lottery chance. Like obviously it's just a game of dice is what it is. Like you either get lucky or you get unlucky, but you have to be mindful on how to treat it and deal with it appropriately. Like if it happens, you have to be quick to act.
Sure.
And I think that's just how our society is trained, is that a lot of people grow up thinking, okay, we can control every single aspect of our life. But obviously, I think when people get older, they start to realize, okay, we actually can't. Like, we can't control everything. There are some things that we just can't. Like, no matter what we do, it's just never going to work. Like, a prime example is when I lost my car. Like, I wasn't expecting for my car to hydroplane, and it did. And I was like, well, like, I wasn't expecting that. But I thought I could control it, but I couldn't because I didn't know how to.
Right.
But I think when you start telling people that, hey, it's random, like, you can't, like you just said with the whole anthill and the African building, it was lucky that it worked. It's random because it's not a guaranteed 100%. Like, you can guess, I'd say you can get a percentage of, like, hey, this has like a 50+% success rate. Obviously that's still 50%. Like, you can't even, nobody can guarantee 100% success rate in anything because things can still go wrong, especially with technology. Like,
absolutely.
As much as technology has improved human society since we had it, essentially, it's still prone to fail. Like, we've seen like incidents with like space missions with rockets exploding and things like that. Like, we've seen examples of it failing clearly. And I think that's just something people need to be mindful of, is the ideas of, it's great that we can take inspiration from nature, but we also have to be mindful, like, it is random. Like, nature doesn't deal with a lot of the things that we deal with. Like, their aspects are, like, the way animals live their lives is, I'd say very different than ours. Like, in some aspects they work in the same
for the most part. I would agree. Yeah,
like, in terms of, like, I'd say people getting their moral structures, like families and everything, they take inspiration for how, like, animals interact with their young ones and everything. Like, we can copy that, but I think there's some areas where, like, some people still question it, like, is this really the best choice?
Yeah. And I would agree with your idea that humans hate random.
Yeah.
We really do. And that's why we have things like statistics, because we want to be able to predict unpredictable things. That's why we have predictive models for tornadoes, which are extremely unpredictable. And that's also why we have statistics for scientific experiments or engineered structures, because we want to see patterns. Our brains are wired to see patterns. We do not like random. We cannot deal with it, And so it is something that I think we fight against in a lot of ways. We don't like random, and we want to be in control. And I think that leads back to some of the issues with AI using these other sorts of systems to be in control of a situation. So we want to understand what's going on. So, which is good and bad, right? Like, so that has led to science, right? Wanting to understand what's going on, and engineering. But yeah, it's also led to, some crazy stuff, because we don't like not knowing the pattern. We don't like not knowing what's predicted. Yeah,
I think especially when we're bringing in human life, like, we're putting lives of people, I think that's when people don't want to start playing random. Because like I said during the whole course of this conversation, like, when we brought up AI, nobody wants to be that person that gives themselves up just to make sure that, hey, it will work in the future.
I don't. I want to come out of the crash just fine, thank you.
Yeah, that's why. Like, I think you put that on, like, one of the questions, like, in one of the, I think it was a test. I think it was.
Probably just to be mean. Yeah. I mean, well, what's interesting about some of the trolley responses, this idea of if you're in an unavoidable crash scenario, what's the best choice? When people don't think they're in the car, they tend to choose the scenario where the most lives are preserved. Yeah. And then I think when they're one of the people that now has skin in the game, the sort of changes. People change their mind a little bit. And so this sort of raises the idea of toggling your morality based on whether or not you're there, which is all kinds of interesting follow-up questions. So, I mean, one thing, so there's sort of two things that I wanted to build on or just kind of bring up here. I think this whole idea of recognizing where we have control and where we don't is extremely interesting, is timeless as far as philosophers are concerned, right? Yeah. So my background, in addition to being an engineering student, I have 2 degrees in philosophy, and we have a rich tradition of philosophers grappling with uncertainty and trying to hang human happiness on the things that are within our control. So I think that's worth sort of paying attention to, and figuring out where that line is of where we do and don't have control, I think, is probably a bit of a moving target in our complex society. But the other thing, probably much more germane to what we're talking about today, that I want to emphasize, is the conversation itself is interesting, and it's sometimes complex, and sometimes there are incommensurabilities that people aren't aware of. So what hasn't maybe come out yet is that Donna and I are actually married, and so we get to work together professionally, but we also have these conversations as a couple. And what's interesting is even sometimes we have a hard time communicating about, like, okay, if I'm coming at this from an engineering perspective and I'll use certain words that I can tell are going to make her twitchy, right? So there's part of this, part of what's incumbent upon people and engineers and biologists sort of looking at biomimicry is figuring out a language to share and a value set and an ability to sort of analyze these things. So I sort of bringing it back to what I said earlier about biomimicry. We're pro biomimicry, but what we don't want to see is sort of the silo mentality predominate. So we can't just be engineers trying to look at nature and copy and paste it. And it can't also be biologists sort of handing down fiats about how nature works. It has to be this cooperative enterprise, which I think people should just buckle up and realize that there are going to be times when, at a minimum, you have to clarify your terms and sort of what are your goals in doing this.
Yeah.
And that kind of builds on work that we've done in other domains as well. And you want to jump in on that?
No, I wouldn't say anything different. I think that, when we're talking about values in nature and the values inherent in an AI system or any other conversation that we've had, it's really come out, and that has pushed us in some of this work. It's really come out that we are not speaking the same language.
Yeah.
That we are using the same words in very different ways. And it's really has pushed forward this idea that this is a conversation that needs to be happening just across the board. Engineers, technology, proponents and developers, biologists, medical technologists. I mean, all of these groups have something to offer to the conversation, and it's not just, this will be a really better conversation if everybody participates. I think that everybody's participation is essential.
Absolutely.
To not making some really profoundly not only expensive mistakes, but morally tragic ones as well.
To Josh's
So
earlier point.
yeah,
I think-
exactly right.
Yeah, I think that, there's just definitely a lot that, whether people realize it or not, there's always big questions you have to ask in every topic. Like, no matter what, like, and I'm just going to address the audience, like, guys, even anything you even think about, like, there's always a catch to something. Like, there's always going to be the pros and cons to everything, no matter what. There's not always in some scenarios, I would say that maybe there are some better options, like, drinking and driving. Don't drink and drive. Like, I think that's pretty straightforward.
Clear cut.
Here,
Yeah.
Clear cut.
I
Like,
agree.
there's clear-cut errors, but then you get into, like, more, like, especially when people start going to politically charged questions, then it becomes a little bit more of, where are we basing our morality and things like that. Like, there's a lot more gray areas, but I think based on time, we might actually be running out of time now. But
I
don't know if you
so.
guys have any closing thoughts at all, or...
No, I think this has been really interesting. I would love to talk again. We could talk more about some of the actual applications of biomimetic systems and some of the, some of the work that we're doing right now to push it forward. So, any last words from you?
No, I think that's perfect. It would be great to touch base at some point, and also just to thank your audience for listening. Apparently, especially if this is a bit off the beaten path for topics, I appreciate anyone that decided to hang in for the whole time and listen to us and whatnot. But hopefully something useful and interesting in all of that. And I think to Josh's point earlier, that think carefully about the embedded questions in any technology that you're working with and thinking about and affected by, because they're there whether you realize it or not. So I think it behooves all of us to think carefully about these things. So
I thank you guys for coming on and at least giving me this opportunity. Like, first big interview for the show, obviously, with people professionals. Like, everybody's still hitting me up, Josh, when is that other big interview? And I'm like, okay, that person is a very busy man. That one is not an easy one to plan, because there's a reason they call him Mr. Mobile for a reason. But I thank you guys so much for coming on. Like, I appreciate this opportunity, and I hope you guys actually enjoyed listening, especially the guys listening at home. If you guys enjoy this episode, I know it's in comparison, like, sorry, Garrett, your record for longest episode got beat by a good amount.
That's right.
But I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. I thank you guys for coming back and listening. I know that it's been very fun and planning this whole thing out and getting it all set up, and I know you guys have been waiting for this one, but I can't wait till you guys actually listen to it. But until then, I'll see you guys next time. Love you guys to death. Bye. Hey there. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for taking time out of your day and listening to today's episode. If you're interested in supporting the show, whether it be financially, clicking the follow button, or just sharing the episode, it all works for me, guys. Thank you guys so much for your time, and I love you guys to death.